The trust acquired this property here in two different iterations, one in around 2000, one in 2007. It's about 64 acres of land down on the south side of South Shore Drive, and then another forested portion up on the north side of the drive over there. We have about 2,100 feet of shoreline along the beach there. And this is one of our most visited public preserves. It's like, you know, close to the ferry landing. Guemes Islanders can just walk around here super frequently. A lot of what the Preservation Trust does is protect super high value ecological properties, which sometimes don't lend to public access, but this is a place that public access is like one of our #1 goals to provide in this place. Why don't we kind of wander on down the trail? We're going to make a left and head out to the beach, and then I think we'll kind of start talking about a little bit of the history of the place that I'm aware of. I know there's a lot of history that I'm not aware of, but if you have any questions along the way, just kind of feel free to shout them out. But you know, I'll point out some plants here and there, but for the first portion we can just kind of get down to a point that's a little bit more scenic and enjoyable to kind of talk about the indigenous and settler and industry history and stuff like that. So if anybody needs a break, feel free to take a break. Keep yourself hydrated, and we're lovely. Well, I think the most important thing to start with is that we're in Samish Nation territory over here. Guemes Island is incredibly significant to the Samish Indian Nation. We're right over in their traditional territory here. The traditional name for Guemes Island is Quanquangula. It means lots of dogs. This place there must have been a lot of Salish woolly dogs in this place at some point. Salish woolly dogs were like a white, very kind of wiry breed of dog that were domesticated for the production of fiber with their fur, almost like a wool, almost like a sheep's wool, to be woven into blankets that would be used, you know, traditionally in the home or traded as currency, more or less. I want to kind of pull up the traditional pronunciation of the place if you guys are interested. I'll just take just a second to get this going. It's kind of nice to kind of start there, and I'll just go around and I'll play it for you guys. It's one thing for me to say it, but it's important to hear the true pronunciation. You hear that, Joe? One more? Thing to have. So I'm gonna get into my next little bit. We're also very near to the traditional village site. I believe I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but we'll go around another time later. The village site was basically right at the Guemes ferry terminal. That's from what I read into the location, and you can see the proximity of where we are. There would have had to be some pretty serious significance to this location. You know, we're just a short walk down the beach. That village existed up until about 1850, when the Samish tribal members, you know, experienced enough colonial pressure at that time that they decided a lot of tribal members moved over to Samish Island. So it was kind of vacated at that time. After a couple of years went by, a lot of Samish members came back and made another village up kind of the northwest side of the island. Here on this property, there's tons of culturally significant plants, one of which we'll talk a bit more later is the cattail in the marsh. Cattail is used as a weaving fiber to create cattail mats. I recently learned I got to go to a historical talk over at the Fidalgo Bay Resort with tribal chairperson Tom Wooten. He told us that the cattail mats were actually used in some instances to build the temporary fishing shelters that were brought out into the San Juan Islands to be used around the reef net sites for, you know, temporary housing. So when you think about the cultural significance of these plants that are growing here, these plants, you know, made possible the lifestyle of local tribal folks, which is like just a really important way to really bring out the true significance of these human and plant relationships that existed, exist, and will exist into the future. There's a lot of red huckleberry around here, which is pretty cool. That's, you know, a culturally significant food crop. We have, there's cedar trees, osa berries, service berries, all sorts of food producing plants. That's just kind of my like broad overview of indigenous history at the place. There's a lot more to be worked on into the future for creating a culturally safe place for the practice of traditional stewardship, and we really hope to work on that in the future. Kind of getting more into the settler times, Guemes Island was named by the Spanish explorer Jose Maria Narvaez as La Isla de Guemes, probably a different pronunciation at that time. He came through in 1791 and named this island to honor the current Viceroy of Mexico. And then kind of between that time and around the 1900s, I don't have too much information about really what was going on here aside from the, you know, the settlement of this place and the displacement of Native Americans. When we get more into like the 1917 times, this whole south side of Guemes Island, to the best of my knowledge, was a large industrial shipyard operation for the construction of barges for World War I. So like way back, you know, First World War. There's a photo on this thing here of what this south shore of Guemes might have looked like at that time. So everyone at your leisure, come take a look at this photo that shows the south shore of Guemes Island basically being completely covered in, you know, rail cars, timber everywhere, boat building, crazy stuff. And then you just kind of turn your eyes and look at it now, and it's just a forest, a marsh, it's meadow. It's pretty incredible, that transformation that would have happened. And all that was done between 1917 and 1924. There's an edition of the Guemes Beachcomber, June 12, 1923, with the headline reading, "Shipyard to be only a memory." So it was a very short time. They only built 4 barges on this site. It was kind of towards the end of the war. And then kind of between that time and, you know, the mid-1900s, I'm not really sure exactly what was going on, but it was eventually owned by the Demopolis family. So this place was kind of locally called Demopolis Marsh, and my understanding was that they allowed the public kind of informally to just use the place more or less as kind of a little nature preserve. But then in 2001, a trio of very dedicated Guemes Islanders, Ann Magnano, Delphine Haley, and Ferdy Businger, all got together and they said, like, you know, we should do something about this place. We should figure out a long-term conservation plan. And they approached Patsy Bullitt Collins to strategize a way to protect the place in the long term. She donated $1.5 million to the Preservation Trust so that we could come in and purchase the place to protect it in perpetuity, and to honor that incredible gift, we named the preserve the Peach Preserve, because Peach was Patsy's little nickname, which is nice. And I'm incredibly happy to have Joe here, who is just kind of giving me a brief rundown of the, you know, the transaction that occurred at that time. And I have to thank Joe for his legal work, which he donated as his kind of, you know, way to make this all happen. Patsy said, you know, hey, Joe, if you help us out with this side of things, I'll come in on the monetary side and we'll make this happen, which is an incredible thing. So thank you very much. You never know who's going to show up to these things, which is pretty cool. Ann was maybe going to be here.
Yeah. Ann Magnano, she was almost going to attend, and she was one of the 3 folks heavily involved in the beginning of this.
But, you know, and since then, it's been a publicly accessible nature preserve. We can talk like a little bit briefly about the ecology of the place. You know, for being only 64 acres, there's a lot of different natural communities present here. First of all, of course, we have marine shoreline, 2,100 feet of it, publicly accessible, which is really lovely. And then you kind of have this kind of like a dune beach grass kind of area with some interesting native plants, and then a bit more of a meadow here into the cattail marsh. That's a freshwater marsh. It's supports red-winged blackbirds, great blue herons. There's eagles that perch up in the trees here. There's a lot of nice like food plants along this edge here. There's osaberry, service berries, all kinds of berry plants along the edge there. And the cattails themselves are incredibly significant, as I was mentioning before. And then we have a beautiful upland forest that is, in pretty good shape. All throughout the islands, we're kind of taking a bit more of a closer look at the forests themselves. Are they in good health? What could we be doing for them? And what I will say is there's a lot of forests that are in much worse shape than the peach forest here. We have it's pretty mature. There's several older trees, old growth trees look different all throughout the islands. And so I don't know if there would be too many old growth trees in here. There's probably some really old second growth trees potentially, but I haven't really gone through with a fine-tooth comb to really see the history of this forest. But there's a lot of beautiful red huckleberry in there and pretty diverse forest. We have willows around the edges of the marsh. So basically what you're looking for in a forest is diversity of species, diversity of age, and structure. So, you want there to be a big old tree next to a brand new young tree with shrubs around, space for light to get through. And so there are some of those characteristics present here. This place, when the trust acquired it in 2001, had really serious noxious weed problems. There was a lot of Scotch broom throughout this whole meadow, and through the dedicated work of SJPT staff, but also some really incredible local volunteers, Barb and Randy Schnabel, our neighbor here, Linda, and I'm sure maybe some of you here today, I'm not sure, but Scotch broom is a really tenacious, invasive weed. It was all through this meadow, and it was pulled manually over probably a decade. We're still pulling it today, but there's very little of it around there. And kind of into the future, as far as restoration, we're gonna obviously keep a good handle on the weeds, but I think the most exciting kind of new and important place of work is creating places for indigenous stewardship to be present here and be facilitated and supported here. So there's a very good potential for sometime this summer. The Coast Salish Youth Coalition is going to access the Peach Preserve to harvest cattails from the marsh to be used in traditional weaving practices, which is incredible. And that's just kind of a very small example of something that's so special, but so needed. And once we have those relationships in place and see how those things go and see what the trust can do to be a good partner and support those things, we can do more and more of those things and hopefully lift up those traditional stewardship practices as much as we can. Just around the corner, I'm sure you all are very aware of the Dogwoods Preserve, a private land conservation nonprofit that has been incredible with forging relationships with the Samish Nation members, tribal members, and the tribal youth. We border that preserve on the north side there, and so we're just thinking that we need to be as on board with those traditional stewardship practices as possible. Whatever the Preservation Trust can do to be a part of that movement is really important. So that's kind of where we're looking to into the future. Maintaining the public access here for people to come enjoy, and don't let the weeds go crazy. Keep an eye on the forests and just try to facilitate as much land access as possible. So does anybody have any real quick questions about any of that stuff? Kelvin?
Not necessarily related to some of that stuff, but I was curious if you could speak on, the properties we protect, each one is very unique in terms of its location, in terms of its habitat, and they have different conservation, we call them conservation values, of its significance in terms of the ecological significance. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the significance of protecting shoreline habitat with the forest paired with it on an island specifically. We talk about wetland restoration and keeping our water on the islands clean, drinking water clean. But yeah, just wondering if from a stewardship perspective, the significance of protecting shoreline habitat.
Yeah, so working on islands, we're here near the mainland now, but the San Juan Preservation Trust is mostly San Juan County. So all of these conservation questions that we have tend to be on a very micro scale, and those conservation values that we're looking for, like marine shoreline, fresh water, mature forest, public access, all of those things are like great to get one of those, maybe two. This place has all of those things, and so when you're like, they just have kind of a compounding factor of importance, and connectivity of all those things. You know, maybe you are able to conserve a property that has a wetland a mile inland, but to have one that, you know, those species, the great blue heron, can, you know, come in here and create a rookery and then immediately go forage, you know, 100 yards away is just super helpful. And you know, fresh water in the islands is at a you know, very kind of
Premium.
It's incredibly important. So maybe this freshwater resource here is not like, you know, bolstering up the source of all of Guemes Island, but it's a contributing factor. And so it's just like we need to focus on these incredibly important resources, and when you can get them all together, it's super, super valuable. Anything else?
No.
Go back at the same exact time. It's usually the same species. They're very tight. All these trees, predominantly conifers, are competing with each other, which brings down their own vigor, their individual vigor. So you kind of have the health of each individual tree multiplied by the whole stand, can then create a problem where you have trees that then die, are angled in on themselves, it's very thick, then a catastrophic fire comes through. What you want in the forest is more diversity, more spacing, openings with meadows that have flowering shrubs, maybe some areas where there's no trees at all. Maybe there's you know, an area of hardwood trees that bands through a conifer stand that's very dense. You know, if a fire is moving through, and I'm just bringing up fire because fire is just becoming more frequent, becoming worse with climate change, and creating these positive feedback loops that we talk about. You know, like a positive feedback loop is something that once something occurs, the circumstances are now worse because it happened, and it just gets worse and worse. Drought, fire, all these things kind of, you know, feed into each other. So when we think about that from a stewardship perspective, like what can we do to put diversity back into these places? A lot of the time people think about forest thinning. They think, oh, let's go in and remove 20% of the trees to thin the forest. But what you're doing by doing that, you're not really changing the structure of the forest very heavily. You're just spacing it out a little bit. So we might think about going in and putting in a small micro meadow, kind of like a clear, very small clear cut, or a selective harvest of a very small area to then allow the understory to grow back into a more diverse place. And that kind of approach, whether it be the forest or in the prairie, that's kind of what we want to do, is create like more of a mosaic of habitats, increase the species diversity. Maybe if some species can't get warm, maybe if these trees can't survive with less water, introduce some species that might do okay or might do better, or just maybe we don't even know which species is going to do better, but if you put in 50 as opposed to putting in 3 or 4, maybe some will do better. Kind of thinking about it in that way. I think, you know, the biggest thing to think about in climate change resiliency is bringing back the historic land management techniques that were used here for thousands of years. Low intensity fire, you know, thinking of these places as food and medicine and fiber producing places, as opposed to just places where humans are excluded from and aren't a part of. The removal of human management is what has created all of these systemic issues, you know, in the forest or in the grasslands that are going away, or in the, you know, the water that's getting overdrawn, or all sorts of things. Any more climate change thoughts?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Oh,
You know, one thing we're kicking around the idea of, should we be planting redwoods? Should we be planting all these trees from all other places further south as a climate migration approach? And for the time being, I feel like the trust has kind of looked inward and said, maybe we should focus more on the amazing, very special kind of ecosystems that we do have that are more drought resilient, like a Gary Oak meadow or an old growth Doug fir forest with lovely spacing where these trees aren't competing so much for water. People are very interested in the idea of climate migration. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. We're just thinking maybe in the islands we have things that are so special that we should focus on those things and maybe they'll work better. But yeah, anything else? What are people thinking about for climate change? What are your concerns or fears or ideas? Dad?
I wasn't going to ask any questions, but you know, back home we're concerned with the rise of the ocean and these subsequent, they're talking about inches to feet through the next 30, 40, 50 years. Is that happening out here as well?
That's something I'm thinking might be happening right here, right now, and I don't want to... Oh, like sea level rise. What are going to be the impact of sea level rise? And I think, one thing that the Preservation Trust and all land conservation entities do, that is the number one step, is, conserve those places. Go out and preserve wetlands, preserve shoreline, so that we can even have some time to determine what we're going to do with these places, as opposed to immediately developing them, coming in and hardening shorelines, coming in and manipulating shorelines to put in a road or stuff like that. But this, I have to do some research into this, but this could potentially be a place where there is a little bit of saltwater intrusion coming into this marsh. And so it's certainly happening. Out in the islands, further off the coast here, we might be in a little bit of a better situation with having some nice, more rocky shorelines that are a little bit more resilient, but all of our islands and even in here in the coast, way into Skagit County, very tidally influenced. So there's a lot going on. Beavers is just popping up into my mind. The idea that a lot of these kind of low-lying places where freshwater is meeting the saltwater used to have a lot more diversity of channels to allow for water coming up and down. Via beaver habitat, Yes, there are some beavers over in the kind of
valley, in the valley.
The valley on the east side of the island. I'm not sure exactly the local name for it. They were here. Beavers are gonna cause some problems, that's for sure. How do we work through those problems it's gonna be pretty important over the next decade or so. With the fact that they're moving around. They're coming out to the island. The previous walk and talk was actually almost entirely focused on beaver habitat at JB Farm on Orcas Island, where we have a valley that has been kind of channelized over time, and in order to put a bit more of a wetland diversity back into that place, we're actually putting in fake beaver dams to slow down the water, hold the water on the island, keep the groundwater welled up as much as possible before it just flows right out of here and right into the salt. If you can create healthy wetlands that have these beautiful braided river systems and ponds and slow water, fast water, wetland plants that provide a lot of incredible habitat for all the wildlife, you're also holding the water on the land. That's like a very important thing. So climate change is a very big topic, but a lot of the stuff that we already know about creating diverse habitats, I was just speaking with somebody about fire resiliency. A lot of the work that we do or think of for fire also just benefits the forest health overall. So there's a lot of things that we're already doing that we need to keep doing that are going to be very beneficial for climate change. And what was your other question? Was that it?
No, I think that was it, yeah. Cool. You knocked it out of the park. I think the only... Oh, we got a question down here.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, we did. Oh, and raccoons.
Yeah, deer
Could you repeat
have
the
a
question,
huge
Ben?
impact. What do deer do, or do deer have an impact on Guemes Island, and what's the balance of predator-prey relationships?
Coyotes.
You were
Got a lot
mentioning
of
on the
those, too.
islands, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, we had like an almost 80% die-off of the deer. There was a virus or a blight, something just blew through the population.
Blood disease.
Blood disease. killed almost all of them. And in those years subsequent, we saw incredible wildflowers, incredible plant growth, which just goes to show that like all of these plants are still here in their bulb form, like working very hard to survive. But the removal of like predators, you know, that's something as a newcomer to these islands, I'm not entirely sure what we had out there, but there must have been cougar, potentially, probably some bears, probably, you know, there's coyotes here on Guemes, so there's definitely, we just don't have that many predators around. So they're, you know, obviously overpopulated, and then they go for all the tastiest stuff, and they kind of negatively impact the native prairies, native ecosystems, and non-native plantings, you know, people's gardens and flowers and things like that. One thing that the Trust is doing, it's a very small kind of movement towards maybe trying to curtail some of this, is opening up one of our preserves to public hunting. People might not assume that a preservation trust, you know, the word preservation, when you think about it at the higher level, generally means very hands-off. Conservation tends to be a bit more, let's interact with this stuff. But land trusts like us are having to change our methods of interacting with the land. Like I said, we're no longer just putting up a fence and backing off and expecting everything to fix itself. We have to be more active. We have to be intentional with managing the landscapes. And one of those things is bringing back hunting. A couple deer came off that property this year. It's not like a big change to the overall population on San Juan Island, but we're working through those relationships. You know, we're working with Department of Fish and Wildlife. How does this work? What do people think about this? Does it interact with other public access? Is it going to be too hard? Is it going to be bad public perception? We're working through all these things, but I think most folks are on board with deer hunting these days. I think it's a good thing to do, and so we're definitely incentivizing that by working with the land bank that works right next to us, the San Juan County Conservation Land Bank, us, and then the Fish and Wildlife Service just kind of manages the whole thing. People can come on and reserve the property for the whole day. Them and their pals, they come out and they can hunt and hopefully get a deer. And it has been very successful. So we hope maybe that would have an impact. And one thing I do hear is that in the islands, it's just difficult to access public land for hunting. There's very few places that you can go and do that. It tends to be more of a private, somebody knows somebody and they let you come hunt their orchard and that kind of thing. So it's something new, something not so new, but we're doing more of, and we want to do more of that as well. Shall we wander on?
How about rabbits? Do you have a rabbit problem?
Oh.
Let's speak about rabbits.
Well, how are the coyotes doing? Don't you guys have some of those out here?
We don't have rabbits, but we have a lot of coyotes, and they kind of take care of a lot of the fawn problem. I mean, not the fawn problem, but which is so sad.
Yeah,
You hear them in the middle of the night catching one, and it's awful.
You need
So-
to get
San
the
Juan
rabbits
Island,
over here.
You know, we have
For
a
the coyotes.
bunch of rabbits, and these islands, you know, after colonialism, it was just basically people just doing all sorts of weird stuff,
Yeah.
bringing animals out, bringing out the red foxes to San Juan, bringing out. Oh yeah, we've got rabbits. Now we need to bring in foxes, and now there's just a whole big thing. So, I guess getting a native predator back would be, I think, the best approach to that sort of stuff. Rabbit hunting club, potentially. I don't know how that would go. Yeah, I mean, these things, they hit what, you know, obviously what we all know as like the carrying capacity, you know, especially with an invasive population. When they're in a new place, they don't have the predators, they just boom. But all populations have the carrying capacity where bad stuff starts to happen, you know. They mow down all their resources and the population goes back down, or the hawk population is way up, so then things tend to balance out. But with non-native species, like, is it a native rabbit or no?
No, we don't have rabbits here.
Oh, there's no rabbits.
We have raccoons, but again, they come and go. You
Yeah.
know,
Orcas,
just
it's a Belgian hare.
yeah.
Yeah, the fluffy ones right at the landing.
Yep. Yeah.
It's a non-native.
It's a non-native, yeah. But it may be different on other islands.
Interesting.
Yes, they do.
No, we're doing great on time. I just wanted to jump in because I wanted to ask you about climate change in particular. particular, because as a land trust, we protect this land, and then it's our forever responsibility to manage it. And if you just stop and think about that.
Forever.
Like, forever.
Forever.
We've been around since 1979, and fingers crossed we'll be here till 2079 and well beyond that. But it is a forever responsibility, and the Peach Preserve is just one site that Ben stewards. And we have a whole stewardship team, and this is just one location. And so these changes we're seeing are just, thanks so much for sharing about that and kind of some of our restoration work that we're doing, as well as just when we see what's happening even right behind us here, and we stop and think and kind of monitor it, see what's going on, see the changes year to year. That's part of that forever management. And then we come up with management plans that will enhance the ecosystem health, preserve fresh water quality in the islands, things like that, wildfire resiliency in the forest with some of the tactics that Ben talked about. So yeah, I just wanted to jump in here and add that, just because it's forever is
A long time.
you know? and this land has been here forever as well, but it'll be here, and we're here to take care of it, and we're committed to that.
Yeah.
But it is in the face of climate change, in the face of a changing world. It's a big undertaking, and it takes not only the staff of the Preservation Trust, but all the volunteers. We have well over 100 volunteers who donate. Last year I think it was 1,000 hours of time out on the land with us. So volunteers make it happen, as well as just the community coming together and helping us not only conserve the vital landscapes that we have, but then care for them in perpetuity. And we can learn from them. We can learn from our indigenous partners and state, federal partners, county partners, etc., and do this work collectively. But it's a big undertaking.
Yeah, it's a lot, and I rely very heavily on my volunteers. So
Yeah.
if anybody ever wants to come help volunteer, give us a call.
Yeah.
Lots to do.
Shall we keep going?
Yeah, and then what we'll do is we'll get back up to the spot. Yeah, what's up?
Did you ever consider cutting dead trees?
Probably not if they're not too much of a fire risk. And dead standing trees are actually really, really valuable for all sorts of wildlife. Nesting birds, nesting in the cavities. I think that I've heard some stat. This is a land trust thing or a land steward thing. I heard a stat. I can't cite it, but a tree supports more life when it's dead than when it's alive.
Oh, interesting.
More species of insects and birds and mammals and reptiles.
These trees have
and
died just in the last
dead,
4 years, he said, and also all these rose hips have just grown up like crazy, blocking. I can't imagine they're not encroaching in on the swamp.